without further ado, I will call upon our first speaker, Ian Ralston, someone who I don't think needs any sort of description or introduction, but he's going to give us a little bit of a reminisce of going back to his undergrad days when he actually dug in Argyll and Orkney with Anna. So Ian, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to say a little bit about my friend and colleague of long standing, Dr. Anna Ritchie. What I'd like to do most is exactly what John has said, and also to talk about Anna's other period interests in Scottish archaeology. I'll steer well clear, for the most part, of the first millennium AD, on which you're the experts and on which you'll hear far more in the conference proceedings that will follow shortly. So I'll look a little bit at Anna's contributions to other periods, really right through Scottish prehistory. And I'll focus a little on the various aspects that John has mentioned. Right, what I'd like to do then is, as I've said, to do a brief resume of various aspects of Anna's career, concentrating on those aspects that John has mentioned, and steering in large measure away from her contribution to the first millennium AD. Next slide, please. Okay, here we are. What I'd like to do is then drawn on a number of sources. What I haven't done is consulted colleagues. I wasn't sure how far under wraps today's proceedings were. So I've drawn largely from other sources, including Sheila Haney's excellent piece in the announcement of this conference. Next slide, please. Now, what I wanted to do was to focus on a number of different issues. Anna's career from Surrey through where she was at school in Woking, living at Rickford outside Woking in that county, and then subsequently at University College Cardiff in the then newish archaeology department of Professor Richard Atkinson, and then subsequently at Edinburgh. Stuart Piggott's diary in 1965 announces that she's going to come to Edinburgh. There's a little note to himself there, and that's where she did her archaeological research. Now, I'm very sorry because I could only see these screens in matchbox size, so I can't read my own text. But what I want to do is to go on from there into other aspects of Anna's career, both in terms of publications and in terms of her fieldwork. So let's look at some of these. Next, please. The Edinburgh department she arrived at, although already housed in 19 George Square, was a very different building from what it's since become, as the university has done it up in large measure. It was an altogether more primitive place in the 1960s, as Mary Jane Mountain's little survey in the Festschrift for Charles Thomas makes clear. And indeed, into more recent times, it had pretty dodgy electrics, it has to be said. Anna's first work here on her PhD was on later prehistory, not on the first millennium AD, and she submitted her PhD in 1969. Could I have the next slide, please? Here it is, submitted in 1969 and awarded in 1970. And many of you will recognize the elegant script of Ian Scott on the title page here. It was a wide-ranging survey of Britain, the settlement record, the unenclosed settlement record of Britain in the first millennium BC. And I pick out from it consideration of palisades. Now, of course, a category of sites much more widely distributed and known for the first millennium BC, and indeed for the early historic period. And here's a map published in 1970, drawing on the thesis and published in Scottish Archaeological Forum. Next slide, please. Her early excavations in Scotland were with her new husband, Graham Ritchie, also an Edinburgh postgraduate who moved rapidly to the Royal Commission. They were married in 1968, and my first field experience with them was in Achnacrie, across in Argyll in 1969. A delightful excavation where we lived on the farm close to this still significant site in terms of the development of Scottish Iron Age studies. Achnacrie was a first project. Of course, it was on the back of the Royal Commission's work across in Argyll. But when Anna began work in her own right as a director, next slide, please, her significant projects were all in Orkney. 3 of them, of which Point of Buccoy is probably the one best known to scholars, certainly the one best known to scholars of the first millennium AD. The other 2 are important Neolithic sites, both of which Anna, at some considerable remove chronologically, took over from other excavators and saw through to publication. Next slide, please. Both the Nap of Howard, the significant upstanding stone-built buildings conjoined on Papa Westray, and the stalled cairn on home of Papa Westray were then fully published, characteristic of Anna's work, the latter in a significant monograph from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Next, please. In the case of Buccoy, which was her first excavation, there was a team of Americans, senior Dutch amateur and Edinburgh undergraduates who undertook this excavation, which Anna published promptly. Probably in terms of the first millennium, its most significant and rousing addition to the record is the famous Jelly Baby House, here figured from Anna and Graham's general survey published in 1981, of which more slightly later. And in the slide here below, the formidable pile of turf cleared off the Point of Buccoy site, excavated because it was eroding into the sea and overlain by the track leading to Bursey itself. The excavation was run completely there. Next slide, please. What we also see is here is the crew on the photographic tower, and I've included this one as probably a better photograph of Anna herself at the time of her first significant excavation. And I've also highlighted her colleague, Dr. Isla McInnes, also an Edinburgh postgraduate of that period, who worked and was a specialist on Scottish Neolithic pottery. Next, please. Now, from the outset, Anna published either with Graham or in her own right, works of more general consumption. And here are just a couple of examples from the Heinemann Educational Series, edited by David Wilson, now Sir David Wilson, Edinburgh and South East Scotland. and a first foray into Pictish archaeology in the volume for the old Edinburgh publishers Chambers, published in 1977 by Anna herself. Next, please. What I put on here is the other side of this public engagement, and that was television programs, notably to begin with schools television, some with Gordon Minges, the distinguished Scottish producer, maker of all sorts of things, including Scotland Rye. I put here too some of the other mainline broadcast programs, but the early ones are those I remember. I put on a Series 1 Range Rover here because one of my first engagements with television, the only time I've ever been in a Range Rover, was when Ian Shepherd and I were taken out to the Pentlands in the gathering gloom to wave flaming spears. I'm not sure whether we were Picts or Vikings, but it was in one of these series, and that must have been in 1969 or 70, as Range Rovers 3-door monstrosities were new then. Next, please. The first thing that Anna did, or a major thing that Anna did in her own right that covered the whole of Scotland, was act as the editor for the series that you see here, published by the Royal Commission. I put on volumes by other authors, but Anna herself did Orkney and Shetland, as well as acting as series editor for these. And they covered the whole country in 8 volumes, published over a couple of years, and excellently overseen by Anna. Next, please. There are a whole series of guidebooks and introductions to periods, both first millennium AD and earlier, and a general guidebook produced with Graham through the 1980s and 1990s. The last of these being the Oxford Archaeological Guide, the best glove compartment book on Scottish archaeology, published with Graham in the series edited by Barry Cunliffe in 1998. Next, please. Perhaps the most remarkable contribution of the 1990s are the 3 volumes for Historic Scotland in their Batsford series that you see here. And a couple of them, I'm sure, are well known to First Millennium AD scholars and those with an interest in the period, on Viking Scotland and on Iona. But there's also one on prehistoric Scotland, published the 3 between 1993 and 1997, and really representing a significant addition to what my French colleagues would call the haute vulgarisation of Scottish prehistory, good quality books for a general readership. Next, please. Anna continued to her interests in the islands, and I put on 1 volume again, which will be familiar to you, Sea Change, edited with Jane Downs, and in which McCoy is reassessed from 2003, and an earlier volume from the MacDonald monographs published in Cambridge on the Neolithic of Orkney seen in wider context, both edited very well and got ready by Anna for publication. Next, please. Whilst the Northern Isles and Orkney in particular have perhaps been a main focus, of course there's also work on Historic Bute, which Anna edited for the SSNS and published in 2012. And another significant volume on a multi-period site at Cullelan Farm, which again saw Anna collecting together diverse bits of earlier fieldwork and producing an excellent overview of that site. Cullelan Farm sits near Loch Grunert at the north end of Islay. So by no means exclusively a northern insular focus. Next, please. What I'm not going to say anything about is what has become the main thread, the main contribution that Anna has made. And I've just simply put a series of volumes that she's been involved in for the first millennium AD. And you will know these works better than I do. The one with Ian Scott and Tom that looks at the faces of Scotland is a particular favourite of mine. So scholarly and more wide-ranging publications for the period of your interest too. Next slide, please. What I don't want to say anything very much about is Anna's wider contributions to archaeology as a discipline, and some of the main things amongst which are listed here on this slide, ranging from her contributions to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland as its editor on at least 2 sets of occasions, through to contributions to the London Antiquaries, to the British Museum, to the National Museum of Scotland, and to the late lamented Ancient Monuments Board. This is a hand, if I can explain it or describe it in those terms, which will never be matched, I would suggest, and again is a very significant and important contribution to the development of our discipline in all its periods, down the lengthy period with which in which Anna has been engaged in it. Next slide, please. Well, I'd like to end up with this slide for a particular book. Again, it's a joint product with Graham Ritchie, published initially in 1981 for Thames and Hudson's Ancient Peoples and Places series, and the only, as it were, national volume in that series related to Britain. There are original ones of parts of England, but the Scottish volume, I think, is particularly significant. It was reissued by Edinburgh University Press, updated in 1991 with added notes and a new bibliography. And it's really the first significant synthesis of Scottish archaeology, both prehistory and running into the first millennium AD, since Gordon Child's Prehistory in 1935, which didn't engage with the first millennium AD, and has been the precursor of numbers of volumes that have followed since. It again was able to draw on the Ritchies, both Anna and Graham's work, and I've finished here by adding a little slide of the Achna cairn that was where we came in 1969. All this work, I think, shows that Dr. Anna Ritchie is a very worthy honourand of this weekend's Common Ground Conference. I personally look forward to hearing the lectures that are about to be given, and I'm sure they will make plain in numerous ways the contributions Anna has made to the development of the study of first millennium AD Scotland. So, with apologies for whatever happened to Zoom, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the rest of the weekend's proceedings.